The question this week is a training one, and the sets that you write and the basic structure of the set and the background of the set is going to influence the skills that athletes can learn. And so it's important to differentiate between the types of sets and the impacts that those type of sets can have on what happens and why they're useful. So the question itself was, what's the value of doing threshold 100s on 10 to 15 seconds rest when we can do 50s at 400 pace at the same heart rate? It's a really interesting question because the answer informs the type of work that you're going to include, which is going to influence the physical fitness that swimmers develop, as well as the skills that they learn throughout the training process. So the question deals with the concept of specificity and why not try to make things as specific as possible, especially if there's no cost to doing so. And the potential problem with that is that we often tend to view specificity from one or two different perspectives instead of all of the perspectives that specificity can be viewed from. So a big one is specificity of speed. And so we tend to think that if something's not specific to race speed, then it's not specific to racing. And that's definitely not necessarily the case because an activity could be specific for a lot of other ways, even if you're not traveling at race speed. An activity could be specific to the type of skills that athletes are using. It could be specific in a lot of different ways. It could be specific to the forces that are created. There's a lot of different ways that we can view specificity other than just speed. Another potential issue is that we tend to see the physiological changes from one or two perspectives as well. And so we tend to think if an activity has a very similar heart rate to another activity, that they have a similar physiological impact, and that's not necessarily the case either. So that's the heart of the question. If we have two different activities that are being performed at similar heart rates, why wouldn't we choose the activity that performs swimming at speeds that are closer to race speed? And the confusion here surrounds the issue of what is actually specific. And also there's an issue with the assumption that because things have the same heart rate, that they're going to have the same physiological impact. So we're going to explore a little bit of that and take a look at why both of these approaches can be valuable. They're just doing different things. But before we get into that, one thing to consider is that the bottom line is that a lot of coaches do choose to use threshold work. And the reality is, if it didn't work in some way and it wasn't beneficial for some reason, they probably wouldn't continue to do so. Most coaches are going to include threshold work and higher intensity aerobic work, such as 400-meter race pace type of work, because they both have positive impacts on performance and they have different positive impacts on performance. The real question is why, and when you know the why, you can make the choice that's most appropriate for your situation and your athletes. So the first thing to consider is what's being overloaded and what's being challenged when we're performing one of these activities. So for the 400 race pace type of work, you're overloading the rate of energy production. So you're forcing athletes to produce a lot of energy fast for a slightly prolonged period of time. You're also having them perform movements at higher speed, so you're challenging them in that respect. And by breaking it up to shorter distances and providing rest, you're giving them the opportunity to perform a fairly large amount of volume at these higher speeds. So this is going to give them more practice at race speed, which is going to help them learn the timing and the skills that they have to use when they try to swim faster. And because they get more practice at it, they tend to improve those skills more. And so while both activities are going to challenge energy production, in this case, the race pace type training is going to challenge the speed of energy production rather than just the duration of energy production. Swimmers are also going to get some muscular benefits in the ability to repeat really high intensity efforts and then have a little bit of a break and then repeat those efforts again. So they get a type of high intensity muscular endurance training as well. Lastly, they get the opportunity to work on maintaining their skills at high speed over and over and over again and learning to sustain those during the last half of each of those 50-meter repetitions. So clearly, there are a lot of benefits for doing this type of work, which is why a lot of coaches choose to use this type of work. Now, in threshold type training, what's being challenged? The first thing is that swimmers are challenged to produce a lot of energy for a prolonged period of time. They don't get much of a break, and they have to be really consistent with that fairly high energy production. And that's important because in races, there aren't breaks. So swimmers have to be able to continue to produce energy throughout the course of their race without any break. And that's something that's not necessarily seen in the shorter stuff. They also have to have the muscular endurance and the skill endurance to repeat the same motion over and over and over again with very little rest. And so again, that challenges the body in a different way. They have to repeat fairly high intensity efforts repeatedly, and that's a unique challenge. So the aspects of energy metabolism that are responsible for sustained energy production are challenged preferentially in these type of activities. It's not so much that they have to create a lot of energy fast, they have to create a sustained amount of energy, which is a different type of stress. And again, because they're performing the same movements over and over and over again, they're going to develop a degree of muscular endurance that wouldn't necessarily be present if they're constantly getting breaks. The same goes with skill. They have to repeat the same skills effectively over and over and over again without a break or without an opportunity to get some rest. So from a purely skill perspective, the race pace type of work allows swimmers the opportunity to practice swimming at higher stroke rates and executing their skills at higher stroke rates. However, the flip side, if there are athletes that are struggling to stay long, sometimes the intensity is a little bit too high for them to figure out how to do that. And so that can be a shortcoming of some of the race pace stuff if it's performed exclusively. On the other hand, doing the threshold type work provides swimmers with a lot of opportunities to work on their stroke length and keeping things really long, even while working fairly hard. The challenge here is that the speeds are often too slow for athletes to learn how to maintain that length at higher stroke rates. So in reality, these two types of training are complementary because one addresses the weaknesses of the other. And these two types of training also tend to complement each other from a metabolic or a training standpoint as well. Adding threshold work will tend to allow athletes to improve their ability to recover between race pace efforts. So that means swimmers will be able to either perform more race pace efforts or they'll be able to perform them at higher speed because they're recovering better during rest periods. So in that way, adding threshold work can allow for higher quality practice during race pace sets. On the other hand, adding race pace training to a steady dose of threshold work will allow athletes to learn how to improve their speed and get out of that same rhythm that they're used to swimming in all the time. And that can allow for better threshold training because they're able to perform that threshold work at higher speeds. So again, that allows for more quality practice during threshold sets. So rather than thinking of one of these types of training as better than the other, consider that they complement each other because they work on different aspects of performance, and working on multiple aspects of performance typically allows for the development of a more well-rounded athlete. Now let's consider two swimmers, one who exclusively performs threshold work and the other who exclusively performs race pace work. How would they compare? You'll likely have one athlete that has a fair amount of speed but struggles to sustain that speed, especially over longer distances. And likewise, you may have an athlete that's pretty good at sustaining their speed, but they're unable to create a lot of speed in the first place. So athletes typically need a balance of this type of work in order to be successful. That way they have the speed and they have the endurance to maintain that speed. So the challenge in coaching is the balance between the two can be pretty individual. Some athletes respond really well to pace work and struggle with threshold work. And these athletes can sometimes not only get slower if they perform too much threshold work, they can actually lose endurance as well. And likewise, some athletes respond really well to threshold work. And likewise, some athletes respond really well to threshold work and struggle with race pace work. These athletes can not only lose endurance if they do too much race pace work, but they also can lose their speed. So to sum things up, both conditioning strategies can be useful and both are typically beneficial. However, how you use them is going to depend on the individuals and the events they swim. Most athletes are going to require a solid mix of both of them. One isn't better than the other and one isn't worse than the other, they're just different. However, the difference might be missed if we're only thinking about things in terms of speed or heart rate. And in terms of skill development, this is key because no matter what type of skills we're trying to develop, we're always developing them in the background of training. And if we don't get the training piece right and the structure of the sets right, they're not going to be able to fully express their skills in races because they haven't been conditioned to do so. So that's why it's so important, no matter how focused you are on skill development, is that you get the training piece right so that you can develop swimmers that not only have great skills, but they have the ability to sustain those skills throughout the course of their races. Hope that was helpful. If you have any other questions, definitely shoot them my way, and best of luck with your coaching.